The note under the check had 8 words that would either save his life or end hers. Your girlfriend just sold you out. Run now. Eric Ferrucci's fingers trembled. Just once, before he smiled like nothing happened. But every camera on that moonlit terrace caught the moment a mafia boss realized the woman in the red dress had already chosen his executioners. If you want to know how she ended up in the world of the mafia boss, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. The ocean whispered warnings against the Miami shoreline as Evelyn Gresham laid a leather check presenter on the white tablecloth. Inside, beneath the receipt for $200 worth of Chilean sea bass and vintage Barolo, she'd written 8 words that would either save a man's life or end her own. Eric Ferrucci's fingers brushed hers as he reached for it, his Cartier cufflinks catching the candlelight. His girlfriend Palma didn't look up from her phone, red dress blazing like a distress signal against the dark water. 20 minutes later, the pier would be burning. But in that frozen moment, with salt air thick between them and bodyguards watching from the shadows, Evelyn waited to see if the last ghost of the Ferrucci syndicate would recognize her handwriting. At 27 she'd learned to move through spaces like this without leaving fingerprints, serving tables with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent years learning to disappear. She'd been working at Marineve for 8 months now, grateful for a position that paid enough to cover rent on her efficiency apartment in Little Havana and the occasional online course in digital security. The irony wasn't lost on her. Once, she'd been the girl who could forge anything from passports to banking authorizations, the phantom known only as Vesper in certain encrypted channels. Now she carried overpriced bottles of wine to people who'd never worried about whether the power company would shut off their lights. "Table 7 needs their second course," called Brixton, the floor manager, barely glancing up from his tablet. "And try to be quick about it. Mr. Ferrucci doesn't like to be kept waiting, and we both know he tips better than God." Evelyn nodded, lifting the polished silver tray. Eric Ferrucci. Even thinking his name sent a familiar chill down her spine. She'd been serving his table every Friday for 2 months now, and he'd never once looked at her with recognition. Good. That meant her new hair color, the brown contacts over her natural green eyes, and the 20 pounds she'd deliberately gained were working. The terrace hummed with the quiet power of people who controlled shipping routes and real estate empires, who never asked the price of anything because they owned the answers. Evelyn understood that world intimately. It was the same world that had taken her twin brother Marco, swallowed him whole during a shipment gone wrong, and left her with nothing but rage and a federal agent's business card. "Excuse me." The voice cut through the evening jazz like a knife through silk, smooth and undeniably commanding. Evelyn turned, her breath catching despite 3 years of training herself not to react. Eric Ferrucci stood closer than she'd anticipated, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with warning. He was tall, forcing her to tilt her chin up to meet his gaze, with silver threading through black hair that had been styled with the kind of casual precision that cost more per session than Evelyn made in a week. His suit was charcoal Tom Ford, unmistakably Italian, tailored to perfection. "Your check, sir," Evelyn said quietly, keeping her voice steady as she lifted the leather presenter. She tried to ignore how the moonlight carved shadows across his jaw, how the faint scent of his cologne reminded her of expensive hotels and dangerous decisions. "I haven't asked for it yet." Eric's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "My companion is still finishing her wine." Evelyn's gaze slid past him to the woman at the table. Palma DeVoe sat in a crimson dress that probably cost more than a semester of tuition, her phone pressed to her ear despite the restaurant's policy against calls. Her lips moved in rapid Italian, too quiet for most people to hear, but Evelyn had spent months learning to read those lips, and the words she caught made her decision crystallize like ice in her chest. "I apologize, Mr. Ferrucci," Evelyn said, placing the check presenter on the edge of his table, her fingers trembling just slightly. I thought you'd requested it earlier. She walked away before he could respond, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she heard the leather folder open, heard the silence that followed. Evelyn didn't turn around. She couldn't. If Eric read those 8 words, "Your girlfriend just sold you out, run now," everything she'd buried would come screaming back to the surface. From across the terrace, Evelyn felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched, of a predator's gaze tracking her movements. She risked a glance back toward table 7. Eric sat perfectly still, the check presenter closed in front of him, his expression revealing nothing. But his bodyguards, Rafe and Cosimo, had shifted their positions. They were no longer watching the perimeter. They were watching her. Brixton appeared at her elbow, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever you just did, Evelyn, I hope you know what you're doing. That family doesn't forgive mistakes." "I know," she whispered, her eyes still locked on Eric's silhouette against the glittering Miami skyline. "That's exactly why I did it." 3 days earlier, Evelyn had convinced herself she could stay invisible forever. She'd escaped Newark with a new name, a new face, and the promise she'd made to her dead brother that she'd never touch that life again. But standing in Marinev's walk-in freezer that Tuesday afternoon, she'd overheard Palma's phone call through the ventilation shaft. The Calabrian name, Leon Sorrow. The mention of coordinates. The soft laugh that said checkmate before the game was even over. Evelyn had 2 choices. Let Eric Ferrucci walk into whatever trap Palma had set, or break every rule she'd made about staying hidden and warn the man who'd once been her employer, her mentor, and something far more complicated she'd never allowed herself to name. She'd chosen the note. Now she had to live with what came next. Because what Evelyn didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Eric had recognized her the very first week she'd served his table, and he'd simply been waiting to see what game the ghost called Vesper was playing. Newark smelled like rust and broken promises the summer Evelyn Gresham turned 16. She sat at the kitchen table of their cramped third-floor walk-up, hunched over a portable scanner and a stolen laptop, her fingers dancing across keys with the precision of a concert pianist. The report card in front of her wasn't hers. It belonged to a sophomore at St. Benedict's, whose father paid $200 cash for straight A's his son would never earn. "You're going to get caught one of these days," her mother whispered from the worn couch, oxygen tank hissing beside her like a mechanical snake. Tuberculosis had hollowed out Diane Gresham's lungs over 3 years, leaving her voice thin as tissue paper. "Not if I'm careful," Evelyn replied, not looking up. Her twin brother Marco stood by the window, restless energy radiating off him like heat from pavement. He was supposed to be her lookout, her partner. But lately he'd been disappearing for hours, coming back with cash he wouldn't explain and bruises he'd laugh off. The forgery work started small. Report cards became checks. Checks became identification documents. By 17, Evelyn could replicate watermarks, security threads, and holographic seals that fooled bank tellers and immigration officers alike. She told herself it was temporary, just until her mother got better, just until Marco settled down, just until she could afford to become someone legitimate. Then Lando appeared. He showed up on a Wednesday in October, a lean man in an expensive leather jacket who climbed their apartment stairs like he owned the building. Marco let him in without asking questions, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about where her brother had been spending his nights. "Your brother says you're an artist," Lando said, sliding a manila envelope across the kitchen table. His accent was pure North Jersey, his smile friendly but his eyes cold as January. "I need passports, 6 of them, Canadian, all different names, all perfect. You got 1 week." Evelyn opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, biographical details, and a stack of cash that made her hands shake. $5,000, more money than she'd seen in her entire life. "I can't," she started. You can, Lando interrupted. And you will. Because if you're half as good as your brother claims, this is just the audition. She finished the passports in 4 days. The forgeries were flawless, each one indistinguishable from legitimate government issue. When Lando picked them up, he counted out another $3,000 and told her someone would be in touch. 2 weeks later, Eric Ferrucci walked into her life. The warehouse sat in the industrial wasteland near the Passaic River, surrounded by shipping containers and the skeletal remains of manufacturing plants that had died decades ago. Evelyn arrived at midnight, Marco beside her, both of them scared and trying not to show it. Lando met them at the loading dock, gesturing them inside where fluorescent lights buzzed over pallets of unmarked crates. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into the shadows. The man who emerged 5 minutes later moved like water, silent and fluid, dressed in a dark suit that belonged in Manhattan boardrooms, not Newark warehouses. He was younger than Evelyn expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp features and eyes that assessed her the way a jeweler examines diamonds for flaws. "You're the forger," Eric said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Evelyn replied, hating how young her voice sounded. Eric laid out documents across a folding table: customs declarations, shipping manifests, corporate letterhead, bank authorizations. "I need all of these. Perfect reproductions with altered dates, signatures, and routing codes. Can you do it?" Evelyn studied the papers, her mind already cataloging fonts, paper weights, security features. "How fast do you need them?" 72 hours. "I'll need better equipment. A commercial printer, security paper, access to specific ink formulations." "Done." Eric gestured to Lando. "Get her whatever she needs." "And payment?" Marco interjected, stepping forward with the bravado that always made Evelyn nervous. Eric's gaze shifted to her brother, expression unreadable. "She gets 10,000 if the work passes inspection. You get nothing because you're not the one doing the work." He turned back to Evelyn. "What do I call you?" She hesitated. Using her real name felt dangerous, but she'd never needed a professional alias before. "The Evening Star," Eric said quietly, almost to himself. "Vesper. The brightest light in the twilight, visible when everything else has faded." He met her eyes. "That works. You're Vesper now." The name settled on her shoulders like a mantle, heavier than she expected. She delivered the forgeries in 60 hours. Eric examined each document under UV light, compared them against originals, ran them through scanners. When he finally looked up, something like respect flickered across his face. "How old are you?" 17. "You shouldn't be this good at 17. "I've had practice." Eric folded the documents carefully, sliding them into a leather portfolio. "I'm going to need you again, regularly. Can you handle that?" Evelyn thought about her mother's medical bills, about Marco's restlessness, about the scholarship applications she'd stopped filling out because college felt like a fantasy for someone else's life. "Yes." "Good." Eric counted out $15,000 in hundreds. "The extra 5 is for speed and discretion. You work for me now, Vesper. That means you don't exist to anyone else. Understand?" She understood. She took the money and walked out of that warehouse a different person than she'd walked in. Over the next 4 years, Evelyn became indispensable. She encrypted messages using algorithms she taught herself from darknet forums. She forged digital signatures that passed government verification systems. She created shell corporations with documentation so perfect that federal auditors never questioned their legitimacy. The work was always remote, always anonymous, payment delivered through dead drops and cryptocurrency wallets. Eric appeared rarely, maybe once every few months, always in different locations: a hotel room in Atlantic City, a parked car near the Delaware Water Gap, a private office above a Chinatown restaurant. Each time, he brought impossible requests and walked away satisfied. He never asked about her personal life, never pushed for more than professional excellence, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made Evelyn's carefully controlled world feel unstable. "You're too smart for this," he told her once, 2 years into their arrangement. They sat in a coffee shop in Hoboken, documents spread between cooling cups of espresso. "You should be in college, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, somewhere that deserves your brain." "I'm making more money than most college graduates," Evelyn replied, not meeting his eyes. "Money isn't the same as a future," says the man paying me to forge his future. Eric smiled, rare and genuine. Fair point. Marco never understood her relationship with Eric. Her brother had tried to climb the Ferrucci organization the traditional way, running errands, making pickups, proving himself with muscle instead of mind. He resented that Evelyn's invisible work earned more respect than his visible loyalty. "You think you're special because he calls you by that stupid name," Marco said one night, 3 years into her employment. He'd been drinking, his eyes red-rimmed and angry. "But you're just a tool to him. That's all any of us are." "At least I'm a useful one," Evelyn shot back, and regretted it immediately. The botched shipment happened on a Tuesday in March. Evelyn was 21, her mother 6 months dead, her college fund untouched and growing because leaving felt like abandoning Marco. Lando called with unusual urgency, said they needed her at the docks in Bayonne, something about customs documents that didn't match the cargo manifest. She arrived at sunset, the sky bleeding orange and purple over industrial cranes and container ships. Marco was there, along with a half-dozen Ferrucci soldiers she recognized from previous jobs. The tension was immediate, everyone's hands too close to their weapons, voices sharp with barely controlled panic. "What's wrong?" she asked Lando. "Shipment's wrong. Supposed to be textiles, but the weight's off. Someone's trying to move something else under our paperwork, and if customs opens these containers, we're all done." Evelyn was examining the manifests when the first gunshot cracked across the dock. Everything dissolved into chaos. Men shouting, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness, the metallic thunder of bullets against shipping containers. Evelyn dropped behind a forklift, her ears ringing, trying to understand who was shooting whom. She saw Marco running, saw him turn back toward the Ferrucci positions, saw the moment the bullet caught him in the chest and spun him like a puppet with cut strings. She screamed his name, tried to run to him, but Lando grabbed her, dragged her toward the water's edge where a small boat idled in the shadows. "He's gone. We have to move now." "No, no, I have to." "He's dead, Vesper, and you will be too if you don't run." The boat pulled away from the dock as sirens wailed in the distance. Evelyn watched her brother's body sprawled on the concrete, watched the Ferrucci soldiers scatter, watched her entire world collapse into a single frozen image she knew would never leave her. She disappeared that night, changed her name, her hair, her entire existence. Let everyone who'd known Vesper believe she'd died in the crossfire or fled the country. For 6 months she lived in a rented room in Vermont, working as a grocery store cashier, trying to figure out how to be someone who didn't forge documents or work for organized crime. That's when Agent Dacre Volkov found her. He appeared in the grocery store parking lot on a Wednesday evening, leaning against a government sedan like he had all the time in the world. Dacre was maybe 40, lean and angular, with pale eyes and an accent that suggested Eastern Europe filtered through American law enforcement. "Evelyn Gresham," he said as she approached, "or should I call you Vesper?" Her blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your brother Marco died at the Bayonne docks 7 months ago, caught in crossfire between Ferrucci soldiers and a rival crew trying to hijack one of their shipments." Dacre pulled out a photograph, handed it to her. "You were there. We have you on security footage." The photo showed her, younger and thinner, climbing into Lando's boat. "What do you want?" Evelyn whispered. "Justice." Dacre's expression was calm but intense. Eric Ferrucci runs one of the last old-world syndicates on the East Coast. He's responsible for trafficking, money laundering, and at least 14 murders we can prove. Your brother's death wasn't random. That shipment was a setup, and the orders came from inside the Ferrucci organization. Eric wouldn't. Eric Ferrucci gave the order that killed your brother, Dacre interrupted. Whether he meant to or not doesn't matter. What matters is that you can help me take him down. You know how his network operates, you know his patterns, and you have skills we need. Evelyn stared at the photo of herself escaping while Marco bled out on concrete. What are you offering? Full immunity, federal protection, a new identity if you want it, and the truth about what happened that night. Dacre stepped closer. Work with us, Evelyn. Help us build a case against Ferrucci. Your code name stays the same, Vesper. But this time, you use those talents to dismantle what you helped build. She should have said no. Should have kept running, kept hiding, kept trying to become someone normal. But the image of Marco's body wouldn't fade, and the possibility that Eric had ordered his death burned in her chest like swallowed acid. What do you need me to do? Dacre smiled. For now, learn to wait tables. The training took 9 months. Dacre's team taught her surveillance techniques, how to plant listening devices, how to copy encrypted files from air-gapped computers. They gave her a new background, new credentials, a new life that could withstand scrutiny. The plan was simple but patient. Infiltrate the periphery of Eric's empire, gather evidence, wait for the perfect moment to strike. Ferrucci has a weakness, Dacre explained during one of their strategy sessions. He's trying to go legitimate, real estate, investments, clean money, but he still has operational bases, places he feels safe. There's a restaurant near his private marina in Miami. Upscale, quiet, perfect for meetings that need to look innocent. You want me to work there? I want you positioned there when he comes to ground. It's called Operation Catalyst Tide. We've been building this for 2 years, and you're the final piece. Dacre leaned forward. Eric Ferrucci trusts very few people, Evelyn, but he trusted Vesper. If he sees you again, if he thinks you survived and came back, that creates an opportunity. For what? To find out who he really is, and who's betraying him from inside his own organization. 3 months later, Evelyn stood in Marineve's kitchen, wearing a blue uniform and a name tag that said, her name was Evelyn Moss, watching through the service window as Eric Ferrucci walked onto the terrace for the first time. He didn't recognize her. Or if he did, he gave no sign, his expression pleasantly neutral as he studied the menu. Dacre's voice crackled in her hidden earpiece. Stay calm. This is what we've been waiting for. Just serve him like any other customer and wait for contact. But week after week, Eric came to the restaurant, always with different companions, always polite and distant. He never acknowledged her beyond standard courtesies, never hinted that he recognized the forger who'd once been essential to his operation. Until the night Palma appeared in the red dress, speaking rapid Italian into her phone while Eric pretended not to notice. Until Evelyn overheard the name Leone Saro and realized Eric wasn't the only one running a game. Until she had to choose between following Dacre's orders and trusting an instinct she thought had died with her brother on that blood-stained dock. The note was her choice, not the FBI's, not Eric's, hers. And now, standing in Marinev's kitchen with Brixton's warning still ringing in her ears and Eric's bodyguards watching her every move, Evelyn understood that Operation Catalyst Tide had just become something none of them had planned for. The ghost called Vesper had returned. But whose side she was really on remained the most dangerous question of all. The red dress hung on the bathroom door like a declaration of war. Palma DeVoe studied it while applying her second coat of mascara, each stroke precise and deliberate. Crimson silk, cut low enough to distract but expensive enough to command respect. She'd chosen it 3 days ago, the moment she confirmed Eric would take her to Marineve for his birthday dinner. Red meant celebration. Red meant passion. Red also meant blood, and tonight would determine whose would be spilled. She twisted the cap off her lipstick. Chanel Rouge Allure in Pirate, darker than her usual shade, and painted her mouth with the steady hand of someone who'd learned long ago that presentation was half the battle. The slim, encrypted phone sat on the marble counter beside her makeup bag, black and silent, waiting for the calls she'd make before midnight, and Naples seemed like another lifetime now. Though only 5 years had passed since she'd worked the private rooms at Club Vesuvio, pouring champagne for shipping magnates and politicians while memorizing their conversations. That's where she'd met Leone Saro, a Calabrian fixer with salt-gray hair and eyes like a shark's, who saw past her practiced smile to the calculation underneath. "You're wasted here," he'd told her one night after the club closed, smoking a cigarette in the alley where she counted her tips. "You could pour drinks for rich men, or you could become the reason they stay rich." He taught her to read balance sheets and shipping manifests, how to spot shell corporations and layered transactions. He showed her that power wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about knowing which strings to pull when everyone else was distracted. Within a year, Palma could move money through 3 countries before breakfast and negotiate territorial disputes over dinner without ever raising her voice. "You need to get closer to the Americans," Saro had said, his breath smelling of espresso and ambition. "The old families are consolidating. Find a door, walk through it, and when the time comes, hold it open for me." Eric Ferrucci was supposed to be that door. She'd engineered their first meeting at an art gallery in South Beach, positioning herself in front of a Caravaggio reproduction, knowing he collected Italian Renaissance pieces. He'd approached with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to announce his importance, asked her opinion on the brushwork, and listened when she answered. Most men didn't listen. Eric did. That should have made him easier to manipulate. Instead, it complicated everything. The first 3 months were textbook strategy. She laughed at his dry humor, asked intelligent questions about his legitimate real estate ventures, never pushed for information he wasn't ready to share. She became the woman who fit seamlessly into his world, elegant at charity galas and comfortable in his waterfront penthouse, always present but never demanding. Then Eric started asking her opinion on actual business decisions: a property acquisition in Coral Gables, a dispute with a construction union, the restructuring of an offshore holding company. He'd lay out the situation, listen to her analysis, and more often than not, follow her advice. "You see patterns other people miss," he'd told her once, late at night on his balcony overlooking Biscayne Bay. "It's a rare gift." Palma should have felt triumphant. She was exactly where Saro needed her to be, embedded in the operational heart of the Ferrucci network. But Eric's quiet trust felt heavier than she'd expected, and the way he touched the small of her back when they walked into rooms together made her forget, sometimes, that she was supposed to be playing a role. The hidden apartment was her secret. A 1-bedroom unit in Coconut Grove, rented under a false name, where she kept duplicate files of everything she learned. The walls held pinboards mapping Eric's roots, his business associates, his financial networks. Everything Saro needed to dismantle the Ferrucci empire and rebuild it under Calabrian control. But tucked between the surveillance photos and spreadsheets were sketches she'd drawn late at night when she couldn't sleep. Eric's profile as he read contracts. His hands, elegant and scarred in equal measure. His expression during the rare moments he allowed himself to laugh. She told herself the drawings were part of the performance, keeping her cover authentic by inhabiting the role completely. She'd stopped believing that lie 6 months ago. Meeting with Saro became harder to stomach. He'd fly into Miami every few weeks, choosing different hotels, always careful, always demanding updates. "You're too close to him," he'd said during their last conversation, studying her across a table at a Sunny Isles restaurant. "I can hear it in your voice. Remember what he is, Palma. Remember what they all are." The meetings with Agent Volkov were easier because she could play a different character entirely, the frightened girlfriend who'd stumbled onto terrible secrets and wanted protection. She fed him carefully selected information, enough to seem valuable but never enough to actually compromise Eric's core operations. Volkov believed she was his confidential informant, a victim seeking rescue. He had no idea she was setting him up to be her cleanup crew. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Tonight, she'd signal both Saro's shooters and Volkov's FBI team, positioning them on opposite sides of the marina. Eric would walk into a crossfire, and in the chaos, someone would eliminate him. If Saro's men succeeded, she'd mourn publicly and step into Eric's business relationships with Calabrian backing. If the FBI took him instead, she'd testify as the cooperating witness, immune from prosecution, with access to everything Eric owned through civil forfeiture laws she'd already researched. Either way, she survived. Either way, she won. Palma slipped into the red dress, zipped it herself, checked her reflection one final time. The woman in the mirror looked ready for anything. She picked up the encrypted phone, typed a message to Saro. "Confirm your people are positioned." Then a second message to Volkov's secure line. "He'll be there. Come prepared." At the restaurant, she played her part flawlessly, smiled at Eric's quiet observations about the wine, pretended absorption in her phone while actually coordinating final details. The FBI wanted her to wear a wire, but she'd refused. Too risky if Eric's bodyguards decided to sweep for devices. Instead, she relied on the phone, angling away from the table for each crucial call. After dessert, she stepped onto the balcony overlooking the marina, the salt air lifting her hair, and made the final call to Saro's lieutenant. "He'll walk toward the pier after dessert," she said quietly in Italian, her voice steady. 15 minutes. Be ready." She ended the call, inhaled the ocean breeze, and turned back toward the table where Eric waited, his dark eyes unreadable in the candlelight. For a moment, just a moment, Palma felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the armor she'd built so carefully. Then she remembered Naples, remembered the club where she'd been invisible, remembered every man who'd looked through her like she was furniture. Tonight, she'd become unforgettable. What Palma didn't know was that a waitress in a blue uniform had been standing near the ventilation shaft, close enough to catch fragments of Italian carried on the evening wind. Close enough to hear a name that didn't belong in casual conversation. Close enough to make a choice that would detonate all of Palma's careful planning. Eric Ferrucci's father had taught him 3 rules before lung cancer took him at 52. Never speak when silence will do, never trust loyalty you haven't tested, and never let anyone see you coming. Giuseppe Ferrucci had run a modest operation out of Brooklyn, moving contraband and settling disputes for Neapolitan families who needed American reach. He'd died in a rent-controlled apartment with $14 million hidden in offshore accounts no one ever found. Eric inherited the accounts and the philosophy. At 19, he understood that the old ways, territorial enforcers, visible hierarchies, bloody street conflicts, were dying. The future belonged to men who could move money through legal channels, who understood that a shell corporation was more valuable than a soldier and that staying invisible meant staying alive. By 30, he'd transformed the Ferrucci network into something his father wouldn't recognize. Real estate portfolios in Miami and the Carolinas, digital currency laundering through gaming platforms and NFT markets, shipping manifests that cleared customs because the paperwork was genuinely flawless, the illegal cargo layered so deep beneath legitimate freight that even sophisticated scanners missed it. He employed lawyers and accountants instead of leg breakers. And the few times violence became necessary, it happened quietly, far from anything that could trace back to his name. The intercepted messages started appearing 6 weeks before his birthday dinner. Rafe brought them to Eric's office in a secure building downtown, laying encrypted printouts across the mahogany desk like autopsy photos. "Palma's phone," Rafe said, his voice carefully neutral. 3 different numbers we can't identify. One mentions the name Volkov repeatedly. Eric studied the fragments. The encryption was commercial grade, breakable with patience and the right software. Palma had been smart but not smart enough. References to coordinates, meeting times, phrases like, "when it's done," and secured passage. Cosimo stood by the window, arms crossed. "You want us to handle it?" "No?" Eric folded the papers, slid them into a locked drawer. "I want to see how far it goes." His bodyguards exchanged glances. Rafe spoke carefully. Boss, if she's working with the feds, then she's not the only one. Eric leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. You can't stop betrayal. You can only schedule it. Let her think she's ahead. I want to know everyone involved before we move. What he didn't say, keeping Palma close while knowing she'd sold him out required a coldness he'd cultivated his entire life. She was beautiful, clever, useful. She was also planning his arrest or execution, possibly both. The duality didn't surprise him. In his world, people were rarely one thing. The first week Evelyn served his table at Marina, Eric recognized her immediately. The hair color was different, the weight gain deliberate, the contact lenses obvious once you knew to look. But the way she moved, the precise economy of her gestures, the focus in her eyes when she thought no one was watching, those belonged to Vesper, the forger who'd disappeared 4 years ago after the Bayonne disaster. Seeing her rattled something in his chest he'd thought permanently sealed. Vesper had been the best asset he'd ever cultivated, brilliant and uncompromising, turning impossible requests into flawless reality. Her brother's death had been a tactical error, a shipment hijacked by rivals, wrong place, and catastrophic timing. Eric had spent months searching for her afterward, half convinced she was dead. Now she stood 3 feet away with a wine bottle and a fake name tag, and he couldn't determine if she was there to kill him, save him, or something more complicated than either option. He gave no indication of recognition. If she'd returned after 4 years working as a waitress at the restaurant nearest his private marina, someone had positioned her there. Federal handlers, most likely, which meant she was either compromised or playing her own game within theirs. Either way, revealing that he knew her identity would collapse whatever operation was building around him. Instead, Eric reactivated Protocol Vesper, named ironically for the woman who'd helped create it years ago. Any written warning, regardless of source, triggered total operational lockdown. Assume all communication compromised. Assume all allies potentially hostile. Move to fallback positions. Liquidate vulnerable assets. Prepare for scorched earth response. The night of the dinner. Eric noticed everything. The extra cameras positioned along the restaurant's perimeter, lenses too new and angles too precise for standard security. The men near the marina who weren't his, watching the pier with the stillness of people waiting for a signal. Palma's performance, flawless except for the micro-expressions she couldn't quite control, the tension in her jaw when she checked her phone, the relief in her exhale when he suggested they walk after dessert. And Evelyn, moving through her section with the contained panic of someone approaching a detonation she couldn't prevent. When Evelyn placed the check presenter on his table and walked away too quickly, Eric knew what he'd find before opening it. The handwriting confirmed everything. Vesper's distinctive lowercase letters, the specific slant she could never quite eliminate, even when forging other people's signatures. Your girlfriend just sold you out. Run now. He'd expected Palma's betrayal. He'd mapped its parameters, identified the likely players, positioned his own countermeasures. What surprised him was that Evelyn had broken cover to warn him, revealing herself to save someone who might have been responsible for her brother's death. That changed the equation. Eric folded the note, slipped it beneath his wineglass, and made his decision. He wouldn't run. Running meant abandoning the empire he'd built, validating every assumption his enemies held about his vulnerabilities. Instead, he'd walk directly into whatever trap waited at the marina, but with modifications they wouldn't anticipate. One of Volkov's tactical officers was on his payroll. One of Saro's shooters owed him a life debt from years back. He'd activated both earlier that week, insurance policies against precisely this scenario. If they wanted a confrontation at the pier, he'd give them one, just not the version they'd planned. Eric stood, offered his arm to Palma with the courtesy of a man who didn't know his lover had orchestrated his execution. Her smile was perfect, her hand light on his sleeve. Behind them, Evelyn watched from the kitchen doorway, and Eric wondered if she understood that her note hadn't changed his plans. It had simply confirmed that at least one person in this disaster still cared whether he lived or died. That was worth remembering, regardless of how the night ended. The FBI command van smelled like stale coffee and electronic equipment burning dust. Agent Dacre Volkov stood in the cramped space between monitor banks, studying 6 different camera feeds that painted a fractured portrait of the Marina terrace. His team of 4 agents hunched over keyboards and radio equipment, voices low and professional despite the tension radiating through the metal walls. "Audio check," said Torres, the tech specialist, adjusting levels on her console. "Vesper's mic is clean. We're getting clear pickup from her position." Volkov nodded, eyes never leaving the screens. Operation Catalyst Tide had taken 18 months to build, layer by careful layer. Federal resources stretched across 3 states, collaboration with Homeland Security and FinCEN, diplomatic pressure on banks in 5 countries. All of it converging on this humid Miami night, and the man in the tailored suit studying a menu he probably didn't care about. "Remember the objective," Volkov said, his Eastern European accent sharpening slightly with stress. "We want Eric Ferrucci alive. Testimony from someone at his level could dismantle organized networks from New York to Naples." The woman with him, Palma DeVoe, is a cooperating witness, but her intelligence suggests there's another player we haven't identified, someone close to Ferrucci who's ready to flip. Agent Reese, positioned at the tactical monitor, frowned at his screen. What if the mystery asset is a setup? What if DeVoe is playing us? Then we adapt. Volkov's jaw tightened. But we don't move until I give the signal. Ferrucci's survived this long by reading situations before they develop. Any premature action and he disappears permanently. On the center monitor, Evelyn moved between tables with practiced efficiency, the small microphone hidden in her collar transmitting every ambient sound. Volkov had argued against putting her in the field. She was too personally invested, too close to the history that had created this operation. But she knew Eric's patterns, recognized his security, and had skills the Bureau couldn't replicate. "She's holding together," Torres observed, watching Evelyn refill water glasses. "Vitals are elevated but stable." Volkov wasn't convinced. He'd spent enough time with Evelyn during training to recognize the signs of someone operating on willpower alone. She'd lost her brother to Ferrucci's world, spent years building a new identity, and now stood meters from the man who represented everything she'd tried to escape. That kind of pressure didn't create stability. It created fractures waiting for the right stress to split wide open. "Vesper," he said quietly into his headset using her operational call sign. "Status check." Her voice came back seconds later, barely audible beneath the restaurant's ambient noise. "All normal. Target is at table, companion on phone. No unusual movement." The lie was subtle, but detectable. Volkov had heard the tremor beneath her professional tone, the hesitation that suggested she was processing information she hadn't shared. He made a note to debrief her thoroughly after the operation, assuming they both survived what came next. On the monitor, Evelyn approached Eric's table with a leather check presenter. Volkov leaned forward, instinct prickling along his spine. "Torres, zoom camera 3, what's she doing?" "Delivering the check, looks like." "Wait, that's odd. They haven't requested it yet." Volkov's hand moved to his radio. "Vesper, what are you—" The feed showed Evelyn placing the presenter on the table, her fingers lingering a fraction too long, then walking away with mechanical precision. Eric's hand moved to the leather folder, opened it slowly. And in that stretched moment, multiple things detonated across Volkov's awareness simultaneously. On camera 5, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the marina parking area, engine running, occupants invisible. On camera 2, one of their tactical officers, Pearson, positioned near the pier, pulled out a phone Volkov didn't recognize and typed a message with the furtive speed of someone communicating off-grid. On camera 6, beyond the main yacht in the marina, a small launch without registration light shifted position, moving from shadow to shadow with deliberate stealth. "We've got unknowns," Reese said, his voice tight. SUV at the marina isn't ours, and I don't recognize those plates. Running them now. Volkov's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Palma had promised she was working exclusively with the FBI, but the presence of unknown vehicles suggested other players. Calabrian associates, perhaps, or private contractors she'd hired as insurance. The launch bothered him more. It spoke of contingency plans and escape routes that hadn't appeared in any of their intelligence. On the center screen, Eric read whatever Evelyn had written. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A predator acknowledging danger without revealing fear. "Sir," Torres said urgently. "Vesper's vitals just spiked, heart rate elevated, breathing irregular. I think she's panicking." Volkov watched Evelyn retreat to the kitchen doorway, her body language radiating the controlled terror of someone who'd realized they'd miscalculated catastrophically. She was staring at the marina, at the unfamiliar men positioning themselves in the shadows, and Volkov saw the exact moment she understood that Operation Catalyst Tide had been compromised before it even began. His radio crackled. Pearson's voice, carefully neutral. "Command, I have visual on additional subjects near the water. Request permission to reposition." Volkov didn't respond immediately. Pearson's unexpected phone, the timing of his request, the SUV's arrival, patterns emerging that suggested corruption deeper than he'd anticipated. On screen, Eric stood, offering his arm to Palma with the courtly grace of someone escorting a partner to their execution. She smiled, oblivious or complicit, her red dress vivid against the darkening sky. "All units hold position," Volkov ordered, his voice cutting through the van's tension. "No one moves until I give the mark. We're about to find out who's really playing this game." He keyed his mic to Evelyn's channel. "Vesper, what did you write on that note?" Silence answered him, broken only by her ragged breathing and the distant sound of waves against the pier. The camera froze on her face, eyes wide, jaw set, watching Eric and Palma walk toward whatever waited in the darkness. And Volkov realized that his carefully constructed operation had just become something far more dangerous than a federal arrest. It had become a reckoning that no one would fully control. The boardwalk stretched toward the marina like a tongue of wood and iron reaching into darkness. Eric walked with measured calm, Palma's hand light on his arm, Rafe and Cosimo flanking them 3 steps behind. To anyone watching, they looked like wealthy diners taking an evening stroll, digesting an expensive meal beneath a sky thick with stars. Palma felt electricity singing through her veins. Minutes now, maybe seconds. Everything she'd planned converging on this stretch of weathered planks and salt-eaten pilings. She glanced at Eric's profile, trying to read something in his expression, but found only the same impenetrable calm he always wore. Eric's hand rested casually in his jacket pocket, fingers wrapped around the compact Glock he'd carried to dinner. He'd counted 7 unfamiliar positions around the marina, 3 on the north side behind shipping containers, 4 scattered south near the fuel depot. Professional placements, overlapping fields of fire, waiting for a signal that would turn the pier into a killing floor. He'd decided hours ago that if they wanted him badly enough to orchestrate this theater, he'd attend the performance, just not as the victim they'd scripted. Behind them, slipping through the staff entrance with her apron still tied, Evelyn moved like a shadow with purpose. Volkov's voice crackled urgently in her hidden earpiece, ordering her to stand down, return to position, abort unauthorized movement. She reached up, pulled the device free, and dropped it into a trash receptacle without breaking stride. Some debts couldn't be paid from safety. The FBI tactical team crouched behind stacked crates near the northern approach, night vision goggles painting the world in shades of green. Agent Reese checked his watch, waiting for Volkov's signal. Beside him, Pearson adjusted his grip on his rifle, the burner phone in his pocket silent, but heavy with implication. On the opposite side, Saro's 4 shooters held position near the fuel depot, weapons ready, eyes tracking Eric's approach. The second man from the left, a veteran named Gaspar, breathed slowly through his nose, remembering the conversation he'd had with Eric Ferrucci 2 years ago when his daughter needed surgery no insurance would cover. The debt he owed wasn't measured in money. Eric and Palma stepped onto the pier itself, their footsteps hollow against wood that had survived hurricanes and decades of salt corrosion. The yacht bobbed gently 30 feet ahead, white hull gleaming in ambient light from the restaurant behind them. Floodlights exploded across the marina like artificial suns. Eric Ferrucci! Volkov's voice boomed through a megaphone, amplified and distorted. Federal Bureau of Investigation, you are surrounded. Place your hands on your head, and Pai's gunfire shattered the announcement. Saro's men, either panicking or following orders to shoot first, opened up from the southern position. Muzzle flashes strobed the darkness, bullets whining past Eric's head and punching into pier pilings with meaty thunks. The world dissolved into chaos. Pearson pivoted smoothly, firing 3 shots into Agent Reese before the younger man could process the betrayal. On the opposite side, Gaspare aimed high and wide, his bullets deliberately missing Eric while providing covering fire that forced the other Calabrian shooters to seek cover. Eric moved with brutal efficiency. Instead of using Palma as a shield, the tactical choice everyone expected, he grabbed her waist and hauled her behind his body, returning fire toward both FBI positions and Saro's men with the Glock in his right hand. Omega Protocol, he shouted, the code phrase activating his planted assets. Omega now! Palma screamed, the sound raw and terrified, her carefully constructed plans atomizing in the violence she'd orchestrated but couldn't control. Eric dragged her toward the yacht, Rafe and Cosimo laying down suppressing fire as they moved. A bullet struck the yacht's fuel line. The rupture was small, almost surgical, but gasoline began streaming across the water in an iridescent ribbon that caught the floodlights like liquid rainbow. Evelyn hit the pier running, her waitress shoes slapping wood, lungs burning. Volkov's voice still crackled from the earpiece she'd discarded. All units engage! Repeat, all units engage! She reached the yacht's boarding ladder as the first grenade detonated somewhere in the shipping containers. The explosion was enormous, a pressure wave that knocked her forward onto the deck. She scrambled upright, searching desperately for Eric in the smoke and chaos. Eric shoved Palma through the cabin entrance with enough force to send her stumbling down the stairs. Pick a side before the water does, he snarled, his voice stripped of all pretense. FBI, Saro, me. Choose now because this ends in 30 seconds. Palma's face was a mask of shock and calculation, mascara running, the red dress torn at the shoulder. For the first time since Eric had known her, she looked genuinely uncertain. Evelyn appeared in the cabin doorway, smoke-stained and wild-eyed. Eric's gun came up reflexively before recognition stopped his trigger finger. Vesper, he said, the name carrying weight neither of them could afford to examine. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you. She glanced at Palma, then back at Eric. There's a launch, north side, no lights. I saw it positioning earlier. Eric's expression shifted, something almost like gratitude flickering beneath the combat focus. Can you pilot it? Can you trust me to? The question hung between them for one heartbeat. 2. Then Eric grabbed Palma's arm and pushed both women toward the rear deck. Move, now. Behind them, the fuel igniting sounded like the world taking a breath before screaming. Fire raced across the water, beautiful and terrible, consuming the gasoline trail in seconds. People were diving off the pier, FBI agents, Saro's shooters, civilian bystanders who'd wandered too close, all of them seeking the ocean's shelter from the inferno spreading across the marina. The small launch bobbed in shadow beyond the main yacht, exactly where Evelyn had indicated. No registration, no running lights, engine idling with professional readiness. Eric threw Palma aboard, then turned to help Evelyn, his hand gripping hers with desperate strength. Cosimo appeared through the smoke, bleeding from a shoulder wound, but still functional. Boss, we gotta go! Where's Rafe? He's gone, cover the exit. The main yacht's fuel tanks detonated with a roar that turned night into day. The blast wave hit them like a physical hand, and Evelyn gunned the launch's engine, pulling away from the pier as debris rained down like burning snow. The last image she registered before smoke consumed everything: 3 figures in the launch: Eric, Palma, and Cosimo, framed against an explosion that would later be ruled an accident caused by faulty fuel systems and tragic timing. The official death toll would list Eric Ferrucci as presumed deceased, body unrecovered. Palma DeVoe's remains would be identified through dental records that Agent Volkov himself verified. And somewhere in the chaos, a waitress named Evelyn Gresham would vanish as completely as the ghost called Vesper once had. But in that moment, fleeing across black water toward an uncertain horizon, none of them knew which version of the story would become truth. Dawn broke over the marina like an accusation, pale light exposing the devastation that darkness had mercifully concealed. The pier's southern section had collapsed entirely, charred pilings jutting from black water like broken teeth. Smoke still curled from the yacht's skeletal remains, carrying the acrid smell of burned fiberglass and gasoline across Biscayne Bay. Police tape cordoned off 3 blocks in every direction. News helicopters circled overhead, cameras transmitting aerial footage to every major network. Mafia boss presumed dead in Miami. Marina explosion. By noon, divers had recovered a single body from the wreckage. Female, approximate age 30, burned beyond visual recognition. The identification came from a platinum bracelet fused to charred bone and dental records that Agent Dacre Volkov personally submitted to the medical examiner. Official designation: Palma DeVoe, civilian casualty. Eric Ferrucci's status read: presumed deceased, body not recovered. The Coast Guard cited strong currents and the explosion's intensity as explanation for the missing remains. Officially, the investigation would remain open for 60 days before being administratively closed. The documentary that would later dissect these events featured a parade of experts arguing in circles. A former FBI profiler insisted the small launch visible in amateur video footage proved Eric escaped. A Coast Guard analyst demonstrated how the blast could have disintegrated a body completely. A conspiracy theorist with a podcast enlarged pixelated images until they showed nothing but digital artifacts and certainty. None of them had been there. None of them had felt the heat, or smelled the burning, or understood that some questions don't have answers. Only competing narratives. 3 days after the explosion, Dr. Volkov cornered Evelyn in Marineve's walk-in freezer. The restaurant had been closed since the incident, but the FBI maintained access for their investigation. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shadows across industrial shelving stocked with produce that would spoil before anyone returned to claim it. "You warned him." Volkov's voice was quiet, dangerous, his pale eyes fixed on Evelyn with predatory focus. "The note. What did it say?" "That his girlfriend sold him out." Evelyn leaned against the metal shelving, exhausted beyond fear. "Which was true?" "You sabotaged 18 months of work, federal resources across 3 states. You helped a fugitive escape justice. Someone on your team was bought." Evelyn's interruption was sharp enough to stop him mid-accusation. "Pearson. He had a burner phone, shot his own people." "How long was he on Ferrucci's payroll, Agent Volkov? Or did you know and decide it was acceptable collateral?" The temperature in the freezer seemed to drop further. Volkov stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "Careful, you're a protected witness, but that protection has limits." "So does my patience with being lied to." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "You told me you'd give me the truth about Marco, about who ordered that shipment, who set up the ambush, but you never planned to deliver, did you? You just needed someone broken enough to manipulate." "Your brother died in criminal crossfire." "My brother died because you needed leverage over me." Her voice cracked, years of grief and rage finally breaking surface. You found a traumatized girl and turned her into a weapon, and now you're angry the weapon didn't fire exactly how you wanted. Volkov's hand moved to his service weapon, not drawing, but touching it, a reminder of power dynamics. What happened on that launch, Evelyn? Where did they go? She smiled without humor. I don't know. The audio cuts out in my memory right about there. The official recording of their conversation, submitted later as evidence in closed hearings, contained exactly that. 7 minutes of dialogue followed by electronic static that obscured whatever final exchange occurred between agent and informant. Technical analysts blamed faulty recording equipment. Some investigators suspected deliberate tampering. The truth, like so much else about that night, remained trapped behind sealed files and competing testimonies. The fates of Eric's bodyguards emerged through scattered reports. Rafe was found dead on the pier, 3 bullets in his back from friendly fire during the chaos. Cosimo disappeared completely, his last confirmed sighting placing him on the yacht seconds before the explosion. Witnesses mentioned seeing someone matching his description aboard the small launch, but the accounts were inconsistent, unreliable, possibly fabricated. Months compressed into administrative closure. The Ferrucci network fragmented like bone china dropped on concrete. Some operations in New York and Philadelphia fell under Leone Saro's control, absorbed into Calabrian territory through violence that made headlines for a week before fading into background noise. Other territories simply went dark, money streams drying up, contacts disconnecting, as if someone had decided certain businesses were no longer worth maintaining. Rumors of Palma circulated through organized crime channels like ghost stories. A woman matching her description photographed at a cafe in Buenos Aires. Another sighting in Montreal, this time blonde instead of brunette. A third report from Lisbon that investigators dismissed as mistaken identity. The photos were always grainy, the witnesses unreliable, the woman gone before anyone could verify. Evelyn spent those months in a federal safe house outside Tallahassee, a ranch-style property with reinforced windows and agents rotating shifts outside. Protection or imprisonment. The distinction felt academic when she couldn't leave without permission, and her phone calls were monitored. She took online courses in art history, learned to cook elaborate meals for one, and tried not to think about burning peers or men who'd trusted her enough to read handwritten warnings. The closed-door hearing occurred in late autumn, 6 months after the marina explosion. Volkov testified for 90 minutes before a panel of federal prosecutors and Department of Justice oversight. His official statement described Operation Catalyst Tide as compromised by unforeseen variables, Eric Ferrucci as deceased with high confidence, and Evelyn Gresham's actions as reckless but not provably treasonous or criminal. The panel accepted his conclusions. The case file was sealed, stamped with classification markers that would keep it hidden for decades. Officially, the matter was resolved. Unofficially, Dr. Volkov requested reassignment to the Seattle field office within a month. Unofficially, Leone Saro's operations in Miami began experiencing mysterious setbacks, shipments delayed, bank accounts frozen, key personnel arrested on unrelated charges. Unofficially, someone was still playing the game even though the board had supposedly been cleared. And unofficially, in a federal safe house surrounded by palmetto scrub and Spanish moss, Evelyn Gresham packed a single suitcase and waited for permission to become someone new. Again. The safe house smelled like manufactured neutrality, beige walls, generic furniture, air freshener, attempting to mask the staleness of a place where no one actually lived. Evelyn existed there for 7 months under the name Jennifer Moss, a fiction so thin she sometimes forgot to respond when agents called it. Days blurred into each other like watercolors left in rain. She replayed that night obsessively, frame by frame, trying to decode who had orchestrated what. Eric's calm as he read her note. Palma's phone calls in Italian. Volkov's tactical team positioned with mathematical precision. The small launch waiting in shadow like a stage prop placed before anyone knew which scene would require it. Someone had written a script. Evelyn just couldn't determine how many authors it had. The federal analyst who changed everything was a tired woman named Nguyen, assigned to financial forensics and clearly sympathetic to witnesses trapped in bureaucratic limbo. She appeared at the safe house on a Tuesday afternoon with coffee and a heavily redacted document. "This stays between us," Nguyen said, sliding the paper across the kitchen table. "But I thought you should know." The report detailed an offshore account connected to Ferrucci Shell Corporations. $18 million, transferred in 3 sequential movements the night before Eric's birthday dinner. The authorization signature used a specific encryption protocol Evelyn recognized immediately, one she'd designed 4 years ago when she was still Vesper. "Someone accessed this using your old security key," Nguyen explained. "Either you made this transfer, or someone who knew exactly how you signed authorizations did it for you." Evelyn stared at the numbers, her mind racing. She hadn't touched that account, hadn't even known it existed. Which meant Eric had either set up an exit payment before walking into the marina ambush, or someone had stolen from him using her digital fingerprints as cover. "Why show me this?" she asked quietly. Gwen gathered her papers. "Because I don't think you're the criminal Volkov wants you to be, and because someone should know the money's out there, sitting in an account with your name on it." After she left, Evelyn sat motionless for an hour, watching shadows lengthen across laminate flooring. The rumors reached her through sanitized intelligence briefings, details stripped to protect sources, but context intact enough to paint disturbing pictures. A man matching Eric's build and bearing, walking with a pronounced limp, had been seen entering Palma's hidden Coconut Grove apartment 3 days after the explosion. Security footage showed him leaving with a small box, face never quite visible to cameras. A week later, a Calabrian intermediary named Toscano was found dead in a Fort Lauderdale motel. Cause of death: asphyxiation. Method: his mouth and throat stuffed with torn red silk that forensics later matched to expensive evening wear. Leonasaro went silent after that, his Miami operations shrinking like tissue exposed to flame. Evelyn requested a final meeting with Volkov in month 8. He arrived at the safe house with the weariness of someone who'd stopped believing his own narratives, sitting across from her at the same kitchen table where Nguyen had delivered her revelation. "You scripted half this chaos," Evelyn said without preamble. "Positioned Palma as bait, put me in that restaurant, let information leak just enough to draw everyone into the same kill zone. This was never about arresting Eric. It was about creating a disaster you could build a career on." Volkov's expression didn't change. "You're rewriting events so you can live with yourself. The note you wrote warned a criminal and collapsed a federal operation. Everything that followed is consequence. The note saved lives. Did it? Rafe's dead. Pearson's dead. Half my tactical team has PTSD. And you're sitting here free because I convinced my superiors you were a traumatized asset instead of a willing accomplice." He leaned forward. "So maybe stop pretending you know who orchestrated what, Evelyn. We're all just trying to survive our own decisions." She requested release from protection the next day. The paperwork took 3 weeks, an unusually short timeline that suggested either Volkov believed she was no longer useful or someone wanted her mobile again. Either possibility felt dangerous. The morning she left, Evelyn stood in the safe house doorway with a single suitcase and a passport, identifying her as Evelyn Hart. The photo showed someone who looked almost exactly like the girl who'd forged documents in Newark warehouses. Weight lost, hair darker, contacts removed to reveal natural green eyes. A face she'd spent years disguising, now officially sanctioned. The Miami airport terminal hummed with purposeful chaos. Evelyn checked the departures board, flight options spreading before her like futures she could select: Sao Paulo, London, Tokyo, Barcelona. So many directions to disappear. She moved through security, boarding pass for a flight she'd chosen without conscious thought, and passed a man reading a newspaper near Gate 47. The paper was folded to show classifieds, And in the bottom corner, barely visible, was a small advertisement for Ferrucci Properties, a company that officially no longer existed. Their eyes almost met. He had Eric's posture, that same careful stillness, but younger features and different hair. Brother? Cousin? Decoy? Or just coincidence in a world that had trained her to see patterns everywhere? Evelyn kept walking, didn't look back, disappeared into the boarding tunnel. Later, the documentary would feature its final conflicting testimonies. A former FBI analyst insisting Palma died in the explosion, and Eric survived with Evelyn's help, living somewhere under new identities while she managed their stolen millions. A retired organized crime investigator arguing that Palma and Eric had orchestrated everything together, faking her death to walk away clean while Evelyn took the blame and the heat. A legal consultant proposing a third theory, that Evelyn had played them all, using Eric and Palma as shields while she disappeared with $18 million and the ghost of Vesper's reputation intact. The truth, like the note she'd written on that moonlit terrace, existed somewhere between what people believed and what actually happened. A few inked words, "Your girlfriend just sold you out, run now," had rearranged entire empires, shattered carefully laid plans, and left three people's fates unresolved in ways that would fuel speculation for decades. Evelyn settled into her airplane seat, watched Miami shrink through the window until it became abstract patterns of light against dark water, and thought about all the ways a story could end without actually finishing. Somewhere below, the burned pier still jutted into Biscayne Bay like a scar. Somewhere in sealed files, unanswered questions waited for investigators who'd never come. Somewhere in the world, maybe Eric Ferrucci breathed and planned and remembered the waitress who'd chosen warning over silence. Or maybe he was ash scattered across that bay, and Evelyn was simply another survivor constructing meaning from chaos. Either way, she was free, or as free as someone carrying that many ghosts could ever be.